This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Far too often, we hear of illness and death due to foodborne contamination. Upon further investigation, we find that microorganisms caused by ingesting undercooked or improperly stored foods are often the cause. Food safety and contamination is a concern in the manufacturing plant and in the home. Contamination in the plant due to substandard food handling may ultimately contaminate manufactured product and may sicken employees. And food safety principles are also applicable to food preparation in the home, also causing sickness. Food safety must not be taken lightly. The U.S. CDC estimates foodborne illnesses annually sicken 48 million people, hospitalize 128,000 people, and kill more than 3,000 people. Testament to general lack of knowledge or carelessness regarding safe food practices. In the Journal of GXP Compliance, we recently published Compliance Case Studies number 16, Microbial Contamination from Food and that was in November of 2020. So today, we'll discuss this topic and the associated science with the two authors. So here to help us out with this discussion are Bernard Hsu and Paul Pluta. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Quite a lengthy introduction, but this is a serious topic, one that people often don't really put the time and energy into to thinking about and acting correctly on. So, Paul, I'm going to start with you. What was the background on the development of this topic and the paper that was published in the journal?
Well, the topic and the paper were stimulated by two recent events happened in September and October, I think, and they were two deaths caused by bacterial contamination. Now, one of them was a student in Brussels, Belgium, and his circumstances were that he made a pasta dish but did not refrigerate it, and he ate it after 5 days, and he quickly died thereafter. Then the second story had to do with a Chinese family who made some noodles a year ago, froze them for a year, and then unfroze them and ate them. And anyway, 9 adults in the family all died from eating the contaminated noodles. So when I saw these stories, it was an eerie reminder of a couple of past experiences that I had. And, you know, for example, in the industry, we have parties, we have anniversary parties, we have other celebratory parties, and there's food.
Right.
And then don't store the food properly. The same thing in academia. We have parties for whatever reason, but we don't have a refrigerator. So what happens? The food is left out at room temperature, or, you know, workers have food lockers for their clothing, and they store their lunches in there. They store leftover food. And, you know, to me, fortunately, those incidences are only 1 or 2 days, but there's no control and there's no refrigeration.
Right.
And we were lucky. I don't remember ever any causes of sickness due to bad storage. But the fact is, we got to pay attention to this because it could be fatal.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's the background.
Excellent. Thank you. So some unusual and well-publicized cases, like those that you just mentioned, involving contamination of consumables, help illustrate the point here, obviously. Why did the contamination have such deadly consequences, and what was the mechanism of these deaths, Bernard?
Yeah, so when it came to the pasta, that's something that's taught in schools, and it's something that's fairly rare. You'd hear a lot more about it if it was happening all the time.
Right.
But there is a bacteria that's commonly found in pastas and in rice called Bacillus cereus. And normally I think it's almost always in rice, but sometimes it can mutate just a little bit to the point where it can create a toxin. And that toxin is what damages the liver. It's a mitochondrial toxin. And so it's a It's actually like a protein. It's a circular protein that just kind of embeds into cells. And because you eat food, it goes into your stomach and your small intestines, and then it absorbs into your liver, right?
Right.
And so what the toxin does is that when it's in the liver, it goes right into the cells. It actually goes to the mitochondria and pokes a hole inside. And that hole actually facilitates the transport of potassium in. And so inside cells is where most of our potassium in our bodies is.
Right.
And so when all of that potassium starts rushing into the mitochondria, it actually prevents it from doing its function of making energy. And so what happens in patients who have this poisoning is that actually you'll find that their liver becomes fatty, because what that toxin does and what that potassium does is it prevents fat breakdown to become energy. And so that fat just builds up, it kills the cell, and all of a sudden, everywhere in the liver, it just becomes a pool of fat, basically.
Wow.
And so when it comes to the corn noodles in China, it is also a mitochondrial toxin, but it's a little bit further downstream. It's not a protein per se. It's called bongkrecic acid. And so it also inhibits the mitochondria from producing energy. And that's how it actually causes pretty quick death, usually within a couple days.
So it's organ failure? Is that what the people are dying from technically? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds pretty scary. And it's one of those things that you obviously don't even know it's there, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, in the case of the Belgian student, it was left out for a couple days, and his case is also not just the only one. There's other cases that have been reported in literature where a family of 4 kids and 2 parents, like they'll cook Friday night for a picnic on Sunday, and three of the 4 kids will eat the pasta that for some reason grew this mutated bacteria that produced the toxin, and the 3 kids and one of the parents dies, and the one kid who didn't eat the pasta was the one who survived. So it's been widely reported, and we know about this, but in terms of a cure, there is none. It's just prevention.
And is this these toxins that you're referring to, are they only in rice and pasta products, or do we find them elsewhere typically?
So it's predominantly where that Bacillus cereus bacteria is. So from what we found out, it's usually carbohydrate-based foods, mostly pasta and also rice. I mean, the cereus part is like cereus, so like cereals, like cereal.
Sure.
And so that's where we've been able to find it so far.
Because I had heard tell of a case in Mozambique with some beer too. So I guess that's got a heavy wheat or, yeast hops base. So maybe that's, So that, I guess that falls in line with the idea that it is starch based. Yeah,
and the toxin's also heat stable. So if you even try to microwave for, 10 or 15 minutes thinking that you're killing bacteria, you might actually kill the bacteria, but you're not killing the toxin, which is just a very tiny protein. And if there's enough of it, it'll destroy the liver within about a day.
Wow. Pretty scary stuff.
There's another food that's in Indonesia that the government has actually banned it, and has to do with coconut. Yep. And they related the high fat content of coconut to the production of the toxin. So there's a fat component to that toxin as well.
Interesting.
Yep.
Interesting. So I want to take it back to good manufacturing practices for a moment here, because so far we're talking about cases, obviously, that have happened at people's home with home preparations, and really some pretty unsafe food handling practices. But GMP practices are supposed to reduce the risk of microbial contamination, yet we routinely hear of food product recalls found to be contaminated with things like Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella, and other types of bacteria. So why is this so common, Paul? I'm gonna throw that to you first. Why is it so common coming out of a manufacturing plant, and what can be done to prevent it?
Well, I think it's just awareness. It's a lack of awareness of the problems, And, in industry, so, my background's from a small molecule manufacturing, in other words, a chemical type orientation. We're more oriented toward prevention of contamination of the drug chemicals. So we don't want people to wear their lab coats to the cafeteria and things like that. They got to keep the dust from manufacturing and from the labs located in the labs. And then, so that's the chemical orientation. We don't have a bacterial orientation. And, why not? Well, you can't see the bacteria.
Right.
So it's invisible. And the other part is we're not aware of the food being a carrier of the contamination. And so we have food in our offices, we have it in our conference rooms, we have it all over the place, and of course we carry it. So, I'll tell you two stories from my experience which highlight the point. So I used to teach in a university, and one day I had all the kids come into class, and say there's about 100 kids, and I tell them, okay, wash your hands before you come into the classroom. And when you come into the classroom, we're going to do finger impressions. And so their hands are clean, right? They just washed them. Everybody says, oh, yeah, my hands are clean. And I have them roll their fingertips into a plate of agar. And then incubated the plates. And, of course, 2 or 3 days later, the plates are totally overgrown. I mean, supposedly clean hands were loaded with bacteria. So now that's one case showing that bacteria is there even though you have just washed your hands.
Right.
And these are educated professional students.
Of course.
The other story from industry, we had a project where we were getting some high counts in our product. And so we decided, we better meet with the crowd and make sure they're doing things correctly and using clean techniques. So I called a meeting and I had all the guys come in. And I said to them, well, we're going to teach you how to wash your hands. And, of course, they all look at me like I'm crazy. I don't know what I'm talking about. So we put a lotion on their hands, and the lotion had a UV absorber in it, and had them rub the lotion in and then go to the restroom, wash their hands, come back to the conference room, and I had the lights off, and I had a UV light.
Right.
And I had them wave their hands under the UV light. And, of course, their hands glowed, showing how poorly they did washing their hands.
Even
so
though
now
they
they
knew you were
cocky.
going to look at that.
I proved to them that they were not really doing a good job. And when I was teaching sterile product techniques in university, I did, of course, the same thing, teaching people how to wash their hands. And I've observed thousands of hands, some very well washed, some poorly washed. And there was we did a paper on the problem spots in hand washing a couple of months ago in both journals, I believe.
Yes.
And it's really, when they say wash your hands for 20 seconds, that's completely inadequate. You'll never get your hands clean in 20 seconds. Surgeons take 5 minutes to wash their hands. So anyway, awareness of bacteria, good hand washing, that's the key to solving this problem of food contamination.
Very good. Yes. And we will link to that article because it was very informative and had some great tips for becoming better hand washers for sure. So,
and it had pictures of my hands too.
Yes, it did. And the UV lights, I remember. So with nearly 50 million foodborne illnesses annually, this is clearly a serious problem. Foods carrying contaminants are not always easy to spot, as we mentioned, and frequently not a result of spoilage or beyond use states. Although, we do know recognize that happens as well. People leave their food out too long, they don't refrigerate it or freeze it correctly. Bernard, can you tell us about safe food handling practices in the home and share with us a couple more stories where contamination caused by improper handling of food at home was fatal?
Yeah, definitely. Kind of going back into what Paul was saying, and the hospital, on the floor in like the nurse's station or the break room for everyone. You'll always have somebody bringing in brownies or donuts or something, especially early in the morning. And, right. if you're on rounds and you're seeing the patient, you examine them, you touch them, and then you go and grab a donut and eat it. And it's like, should probably wash your hands before that. And the thing is, hand sanitizer is not enough in that case, because hand sanitizer doesn't rinse off the debris that's also on your hands. And so hand sanitizer is good as like quickly in and out of a patient room, but it's not good enough to handle food afterwards. I mean, if you're going to be touching that food and putting it in your mouth and it's going into your body, you better make sure your hands are clean. And that doesn't just go for the hospital, that also goes for in the kitchen too. So let's just say you're cooking burgers, or you're handling meats for steak, or you're having hot dogs or bratwurst, right? And then you prepare them, and then you touch the bread afterwards without washing your hands. Well, some of the bacteria from the raw meat can get onto that bread, and then if you eat the bread without doing anything to it, you may have already cooked the burger or cooked the steak, but the bread hasn't had anything done to it, and so that bacteria is still on it. You eat it and you might feel some, gastroenteritis. You might feel a little ill, might have some vomiting or diarrhea. So you got to be very careful where you have to separate the foods. If you're going to handle meats, just handle meats. And then when you're done with that, wash your hands. And, it's not a 10-second, let me, just coat my hand in soap really quick and rinse it off. It's, it should probably be about 30 seconds to at least a minute. Even better if you wash and rinse off and then apply the soap again and wash a second time. And, over the span of about a minute, then that'll be a little bit better. And so in terms of cooking, right, let's just say you're done eating the food. Then what, right? CDC and WHO guidelines, they've actually gotten a more strict recently. I remember a time maybe about 10, 15 years ago when they said, 4 hours, sure, leave the food out at room temperature and then refrigerate, but now it's 2 hours. And, especially if it's hot outside in the summertime, I know we're on the other side of the world now, it's not summertime here, but let's just say you go out for a picnic or a barbecue like they did out in Belgium, right?
Right.
You want to make sure that food gets refrigerated soon after cooking. 2 hours, if they say 2 hours, fine. I wouldn't put it right in. If you put hot food in a refrigerator, you're going to break your fridge. But be reasonable. Don't leave it out for 8 hours thinking, oh, well, it was cold outside, so that's fine. It's not fine. That puts you at risk for things like, what could be 5-day-old pasta at that point. There isn't too much difference from 1-day-old to 5-day-old pasta when you leave it out like that. And so other things with kitchen too, you got to be careful with pets in the kitchen. So let's just say you like having your dog around. Who doesn't like having their dog around while they're cooking? Well, there is one thing you got to be careful of, because where has the dog been? You don't know if it was outside, maybe it was rolling around in squirrel poop, or maybe its own poop.
Yeah.
And then you pet it, and then, you pet it, didn't wash your hands, and then you touch your food, and now you have dog poop in your food. And so you got to be very careful with having pets, because, dogs, even from their mouth, they have bacteria that can infect humans and can cause sepsis. So I published a YouTube video about somebody getting capnocytophagia canamorsis sepsis from his dog. He was licked by his dog, and we don't know how that bacteria got into his body, except he had a dog, and that was the connection that we have. Also cats too. So cats can have parasites called Toxoplasma gondii. Mm-hmm. And if you're immunocompromised, you can get some of the parasite eggs potentially on your hands. And then if you handle food and then you eat it and there was no washing of hands in between, then you might have parasites inside your meal that you have.
Yeah, and cats, depending on how strict you are, but cats are notorious for jumping up on places. So I can imagine that can easily spread to your countertops, as well as your hands. So you certainly have to be careful with animals. I hear sometimes certain foods like eggs, for example, some people say they have to be refrigerated. In some countries, they do not refrigerate eggs. Any insight to that? Like, is there a potential for contamination with unrefrigerated eggs, or? So
I actually asked about this on my Twitter, and it does seem like, at least in England, the English people on my Twitter told me that they do refrigerate eggs.
Okay.
Mainland Europe, I'm not 100% sure. I've gotten conflicting accounts saying that they don't refrigerate eggs over there. Over here, we do. I know for our dairy products here, we handle them pretty seriously, mostly pasteurized, and it has to go through that process. Like, for example, we don't have raw milk and raw honey here. That's not easily accessible. But in other parts of the world, it is. And so that all goes with risk assessment, right? If in raw milk, you might have bacterial contaminants. And if you're a company selling milk and somebody, drinks it and gets sick from it because it was knowingly raw milk, then they're liable, right? And so then it becomes potential litigation that comes up. So they're trying to mitigate their risk. And here in the United States, with our legal framework, that's probably where some of it comes from, why it's so difficult to get a hold of. But if you're somewhere else in the world that's not in America, then you could have access to it. And just know that it depends on how the regulations are based on how it should be handled, and knowing where that supply chain came from.
I wonder.
Talk about the eggs a little bit.
Yeah.
Depends on the country. Some countries actually have a salmonella vaccine, which are so the chickens are vaccinated.
Oh.
That's the reason you don't refrigerate. In the U.S., we wash the eggs, and that takes away some of the protective coating off the eggs. So that's the reason we refrigerate in the U.S. and in some countries. But the real reason for not refrigerating is the salmonella vaccine on the chickens in certain countries.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And I noted too, in traveling to Europe, that there's dairy products, milk for one, that is shelf stable there. But here, as you mentioned, Bernard, we always refrigerate. We pasteurize, but then we also refrigerate. Is it the pasteurization process that makes milk not shelf stable? Do you know what the difference is there between the two ways of keeping milk and other dairy products?
Yeah, that I'm not entirely sure. I think for milk, at least here, if you don't refrigerate, you'll see it, like if you buy like the plastic 1 gallon jug of 2% or whole,
Right.
If you don't refrigerate it after maybe 2 days, you'll see it become clumpy, and it's like, if you try to pour it out, it's almost like a goop type, and so in that case, definitely don't drink it. And for that, it's like food inspection, right? If it smells kind of funny, if it looks kind of funny, don't eat it, right? And for me, it's like, if there's anything questionable about the food, definitely be alert. To me, what's the most scary is that sometimes it's not questionable and it looks okay, and then you get sick from it. That's the scariest, right? But for like real obvious signs, like if something's green, like there's a little bit of a greenish tint, probably shouldn't eat it. If you can smell it from across the room while it's microwaving, probably shouldn't eat it, right? And so those are just like general guidelines of what to do with leftovers.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And those are a little bit easier to spot, right? Green or white film or something that just shouldn't be there. You're like, okay, probably not good for me to eat it. But it is much scarier when we are eating things that we think are clean, that have been manufactured carefully, and yet we still get sick because it's, obviously microorganisms that we cannot see with the naked eye. And that requires a lot more thought in terms of prevention, I would think.
Yeah.
Paul, final thoughts here on food safety in the manufacturing plant.
Well, to me, awareness is the big thing. We have to be better in terms of saying bacteria are all over, and we got to be careful about transmitting them around the plant or bringing them from, let's say, food areas into the plant. So awareness of bacteria and awareness that they're on your hands, they're on your clothes, they're on your body, they're on your shoes. They say that the biggest problem with clean rooms are shoes. And a lot of hospitals now have dedicated shoes. If you work in a clean room in the hospital, you take off your street shoes when you enter the building and put on your dedicated shoes that have never seen outside of the hospital. So awareness is a big thing. Hand washing is also big, and we all learn about hand washing with the virus, but we don't hand wash well enough. We don't do it often enough, and people think that the sanitizer is a substitute for hand washing. It really isn't. The sanitizer is not nearly as good as hand washing. I mean, you have to do a good job on hand washing. Hand sanitizers, when we were doing a little research on that paper, we found that there's about a dozen organisms that hand sanitizers do not affect at all. And one of them, for example, is the C. diff, which causes terrible diarrhea and, literally kills people because it's so difficult to eradicate.
Right.
Hand sanitizers don't touch C. diff, don't touch MRSA, don't touch some Pseudomonas, some staph, E. coli. So, don't say, oh, I'm going to sanitize my hands. No, wash your hands. That's the main thing there. And finally, the last thing, and what I've learned some lessons here through this whole effort. You got to refrigerate your food as fast as you can. And the CDC guidelines, Bernard mentioned 2 hours. They say if it's above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, it's 1 hour.
That makes sense.
So these outdoor picnics and stuff where you leave your food out, bad idea. So when you deal with food, refrigerate it as fast as you can and restrict the food areas in your plant. In other words, don't allow food in a conference room, don't allow food at your desk, have a designated food room and, equip that room with a refrigerator so that you could put the leftovers in the fridge right away. And that refrigerator should be dedicated to food and not have any chemicals or anything in it. So to me, those are three really fundamental rules that if the listeners walk away with something, I'd say awareness of bacteria, wash your hands, and restrict and refrigerate your food.
Thank you for that. And a quick follow-up for you, since you are an expert in hand washing. My mother always told me growing up as a kid that you had to use hot water. If you didn't use hot water, it didn't matter how much soap, your hands weren't going to get clean. Is that true? Do you have to have hot water? Any water, as long as you're using detergent?
I think the idea is to do a comprehensive job. In the paper, we talk about the problem areas. So the problem areas are skin folds, the webbing in between the fingers, the area of the hand between the thumb and the index finger. I can tell you that there is no person out of thousands that I've looked at that ever washed between their thumb and their index finger, the webbing on your hand. So I think it's more do a good job. I don't think the temperature of the water is that important, but being thorough and getting the problem areas is what's really going to count.
Good to know.
One more thing. Everyone's hands are different, and
right.
We had certain kids like their palms would be terrible. Well, I say, geez, what do you do, for your outside jobs? Oh, I work in landscaping and I work with stones, and your palms are become more creviced and ruddy. Well, that's all sites that cleanliness is hard to get at. No one has trouble with the top surface of their hands because it's smooth and you don't create any crevices in the top surface. So everybody's hands are a little different.
Good to know. Right. And underneath the nails, I know those are problem areas that you have to pay attention to.
Yep.
Bernard, any final thoughts on food safety at home and as we are eating out?
Yeah. Well, just be aware. I mean, if you can control the cleanliness of your hands, right, by washing. And, as Paul had mentioned, when he talked about thumb and index finger, I was immediately thinking, oh man, like, I don't know if I washed that today, even though I do go like this. So it should go into the area, but also there's in between fingers, underneath the nails, right? And there's a lot of places. And so it's like with the hands, you can control. when you're eating out, sometimes you can't, right? And so we mentioned this in the article, and I think the link for the videos will be in the show notes. But gas station sushi, right? That's a joke that I make very often. And so generally in America, sushi is okay. What is kind of shocking to me, though, is that the salmon that we usually get, actually, a lot of it does. This was a study from about 25, 30 years ago, but it found out that most of the salmon that's in the sushi that's sold here in the United States, it does have the Anisakis parasite in it. And so one of the food safety precautions for it is that it's flash frozen. And when it's flash frozen, the parasite is inactivated, it dies, but you're still eating it, right? And so it was always kind of in the back of my mind as I'm eating, the sashimi. It's like, there could be a parasite in this one, and it's like, I don't know. Who knows, right? I've eaten so much of it that I know for sure I've come into contact with some of it, but sometimes it's like it might not be flash frozen. I think that's really rare, right? You can get in big trouble if you didn't handle the food properly and didn't document it. So it is rare, but it does happen sometimes. And sometimes there's other parasites that can come up in sushi as well. And so you just have to be careful with that. There was another case that came out in San Francisco in 2017 about gas station nachos. And it was the nacho cheese had botulism in it. And so I think they're still doing an investigation of it, but it was like an outbreak, and the CDC actually tracked it, and it traced it back to a particular gas station in the San Francisco area. And so they don't exactly know how that cheese was handled, but it does seem like it basically came from that nacho cheese. And so it's like, these kinds of things are freak accidents, right? They don't happen very often, but you have to be aware that they do happen sometimes. I mean, that's not to freak anybody out. That's pretty much a little bit out of your control. But like I said, you can control some things, your hands, your kitchen utensils, having pets in the kitchen, separating so that you're not touching raw chicken and then you touch the bread that's going to go with the chicken sandwich. And then, you eat, you eat some raw chicken traces on the bread. Be careful of that. There's also another trend online that's going around where people are like eating raw meat as like it's a little bit more of an extreme keto diet type of derivative. And these people, you got to be careful with that, because, when it comes to food, there's people who say that they can breathe and that's their food. They haven't eaten for 20 years. And we know that's not true.
Right.
So you have to be careful with the more extreme ends of diet. But for mainstream, right, and especially during the holiday season, keep your utensils clean, keep your plates clean, keep your hands clean, separate the foods out. When it comes to leftovers, make sure that you're refrigerating them in time. Don't leave the turkey out. If you eat that during Christmas or ham, don't leave it out for 8 hours and thinking, well, it's cold outside, so don't worry. It's not necessarily cold in your house. It might be 68 degrees in your house, and what grows in 68 degrees? Bacteria. Right. So you got to be very careful.
For sure. Yeah, I know. And I've read somewhere years ago, as far as home prep goes, a lot of people don't properly wash their cutting boards, or they use cutting boards that are porous, and then they put chicken on it, and, they might give it a quick rinse, but chicken, is one of those that we have to be extra careful with, because it has a lot of different bacteria, or it has the potential for it, I guess. And it seeps into these places. And if you don't clean not just your hands, but all of the surfaces you're using properly, then you can unknowingly, pass those bacteria into the rest of your food.
Yep, definitely.
Stacey, I didn't realize that cutting boards were so complicated until I started to read about this. You have the porous wood, the non-porous wood, the direction of the grain. Some cutting boards are parallel to the grain, some are perpendicular to the grain. And how do you clean them? Some people say you should put your cutting board in the dishwasher, right, because it needs that high temperature and high intensity cleaning. So listen, this whole topic is really a little bit scary, but I think if you get some basic things done, you're in good shape.
I would agree. So the takeaways that I hear from both you and Bernard are to be aware, pay attention to what you're doing, and clean more often than you don't, right? Wash your hands longer than you think you should. Make sure your surfaces are clean, not just to visually, but use a good detergent, some sort of soap, some sort of antibacterial wipes. I don't know. Do you guys have a recommendation for that?
There's one more suggestion on here. There's some pushback that I'll see online sometimes about people saying that if you're too clean, that you're limiting the capabilities of your immune system because then it doesn't see certain bacterias and whatnot. The reality is that you're getting exposed to plenty of bacteria every time you eat, no matter how much you wash your hands. It's the bacteria that causes severe illness that is the issue. You're always going to have bacteria. If you even read FDA guidance on like oatmeal, for example, there's actually an allowance of things that you probably don't want to think that you're eating, like rat poop. Right? Yeah. There's rat poop in your oatmeal, and it's very small concentration, but it's there, right? And so it's like when they say, don't be clean because you're limiting your immune system. That's not true. You're eating plenty of things that you don't think that you're eating, right? Yeah. And it's the severe illness that we're trying to prevent, and that's the thing that we have to be careful of.
Frozen pizza is like that too.
Yeah. Okay. Probably most processed foods are like that, I would suspect.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I think...
Stacey, before you close, let's put in a short commercial for Bernard's YouTube videos, which are really excellent, and they addressed a lot of the topics we talked about today. So there's a YouTube on the Brussels student, there's a YouTube on dogs, there's one on cats, there's a new one on zinc and vitamin C. Anyway, Bernard, give us a few more.
Thanks. Yeah, there was gas station sushi. That's two different parasites for it. Though there's one that depletes vitamin B12 in the gut, and then the anisakis one that burrows directly into the gut. And then there's gas station nachos. And there was also a grandma who ate cookie dough. And so actually she was immunocompromised. So she did get the bacteria from the raw eggs, but because she actually turned out to have AIDS that was undiagnosed from a former blood transfusion in the 90s, it actually wreaked havoc on her body in a way that doctors couldn't tell until months later down the line when she actually snapped one of her bones.
Oh my goodness, how sad. Well, I thank you for sharing your expertise with us today, both of you. Bernard, your videos are not only very informative, they're also very entertaining. So we will definitely share several of those through links in the show notes, as well as the article that Paul and Bernard wrote together recently. And watch for another blog post coming up from them too in the next several weeks on other ways that we get introduced to food contaminants. But I do appreciate you taking time with us today. It's been a pleasure to chat with you, and we look forward to the next time.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. We really appreciate you helping us spread the word. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. You can send us an email or message us through LinkedIn. For today's show notes and information on the Voices in Validation podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great discussion. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.